You have no idea what you are doing near this engine.
I fixed the fault code, sir. The readings are stable.
Don't you dare tell me how to run my show! Stop!
That's what came out of Bradley Hargrove's mouth, in front of 30 people, 3 feet from her face.
Your jet has a cavitation fault.
Just a canvas bag and hands that'd been inside engines.
You go fix broken boats for refugees trying to snake into America.
11 days grounded. 5 engineers done. $220 million walking out the door. Bradley had nobody left.
60 minutes. Fail and I'll drag you out like the dog you are.
She said nothing. Walked barefoot straight to the jet. That girl he called a monkey? She fixed it in under an hour. And Bradley? He lost everything. Man, who is this girl? And how did she end up barefoot in $1 billion hangar? Novacrest Aerospace wasn't some garage startup. It was a $3 billion defense and aviation company headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. Glass towers, private hangars, a fleet of corporate jets lined up like trophies behind razor wire at Charlotte Douglas International Airport. And at the center of it all, one woman. Dolores Whitfield, CEO. 61 years old, former Air Force flight engineer. The kind of woman who didn't raise her voice because she never had to. When Dolores spoke, rooms went quiet. When Dolores gave a deadline, people didn't sleep until it was met. Her personal aircraft was a Gulfstream G650ER. $50 million of engineering perfection. Twin Rolls-Royce BR725 engines. A range that could cross oceans without stopping. It wasn't just a jet. It was Novacrest's reputation with wings. And for 11 days, it had been sitting dead in Hangar 4. The starboard engine had a problem nobody could name. During taxi tests, the thrust would surge without warning, then roll back on its own, like the engine was choking on something invisible. It never happened twice the same way. It never showed up on the static test stand inside the hangar. The diagnostic computers said everything was normal. But the engine kept failing. And here's why that mattered more than pride. 9 days from now, that jet was supposed to carry 4 Pentagon evaluators and Dolores herself to a classified facility in Nevada. Novacrest was competing for a $220 million defense contract. If that jet didn't fly, the contract went to their biggest rival. Dolores sent one email to her entire engineering division. 6 words. Fix this jet or lose your jobs. She meant it. Bradley Hargrove was vice president of engineering. 54. Ivy League. Custom suits. Corner office with a view of the runway. He'd been at Novacrest for 19 years, and in that time he'd built himself a reputation, not for brilliance, but for control. Nothing happened in that hangar without Bradley's signature. Every diagnostic plan, every repair order, every outside consultant, all of it went through him. So when the jet broke, it was Bradley's engineers who tried to fix it, and it was Bradley who approved every single attempt. 5 engineers, 11 days, 5 failures. Here's how it went. Rick Sattler went first, senior engineer, 20 years of experience. He pulled the full authority digital engine control unit, the FADEC, and replaced it with a factory new one straight from Rolls-Royce inventory. Cost? $92,000. The engine surged again on the next taxi test. Same problem. No change. Dennis Cooper went second. younger, sharp, hungry to prove himself. He spent 2 days remapping the fuel flow calibration tables, ran simulations overnight, told Bradley he was confident. The engine choked at 60% thrust on the runway, worse than before.
Phil Underwood went third. He swapped the engine-driven hydraulic pump, spent a day and a half on a component that had nothing to do with the fuel system. A complete dead end. 2 days wasted. Scott Brennan went fourth. He ran a borescope inspection of the high-pressure turbine, threading a camera through the engine's guts, looking for cracks, erosion, foreign object damage. He found nothing. Absolutely clean.
Jeff Lorraine went fifth, and Jeff's recommendation was the one that nearly got him fired on the spot. He told Dolores they should pull the entire engine off the wing and ship it to the Rolls-Royce Service Center in Indianapolis. Turnaround time? 6 weeks. Dolores stared at him for 3 seconds without blinking. Then she said, "Get out of my hangar." 5 engineers, 11 days, $92,000 in parts, 0 answers. And every single failed diagnosis had one thing in common. Bradley Hargrove signed off on all of them. The hangar smelled like jet fuel and cold coffee. Technicians snapped at each other. Tool carts sat half open. Somebody had taped a sticky note to the engine cowling that read, "Good luck." It wasn't encouragement. It was sarcasm. Novacrest was 9 days from losing everything, and nobody in that building had a clue what was wrong. That same week, Faith Thornton stepped off a Greyhound bus in Charlotte with $38 in her pocket. She'd come from Birmingham, Alabama. No job, no contacts, no plan except survival. She found a women's shelter in East Charlotte that had one open bed. She took it. The next morning, someone stole her boots, the only pair she owned. She looked under every cot, asked every woman in the shelter. Gone. So she walked out, barefoot. She wasn't in Charlotte for Novacrest. She didn't know what Novacrest was. She'd seen a flyer at a laundromat, janitorial staff needed, with an address on West Boulevard. That was it. A cleaning job, minimum wage, a reason to keep going. The night before she went to apply, she stopped at a gas station on Freedom Drive. 2 men in Novacrest work shirts were standing by the coffee machine, talking loud enough for the whole store to hear. 11 days and nobody can figure it out. Sattler swapped the FADEC for nothing. Cooper's calibration tables were useless. The engine keeps surging and rolling back during taxi, but the test stand shows clean every time. Faith stood behind the chip rack, listening. She didn't move for 2 full minutes. She'd heard this before. Not these words exactly, but the pattern, the description. An engine that misbehaves on the ground but behaves on the stand. Intermittent surges that no diagnostic computer can catch. She'd seen it in diesel generators, in marine engines, in old military surplus turbines in her grandfather's scrapyard. She knew what it sounded like. The next morning, she walked to the Novacrest campus on foot. 3 miles. No shoes. She carried everything she owned in a single canvas duffel bag. A hand-drawn notebook of engine schematics, 3 socket wrenches her grandfather had given her, and a worn Bible with her grandmother's handwriting in the margins. She came for the janitorial job. She walked through the employee entrance, filled out half the application with a borrowed pen, and then she saw it. Through the glass wall at the end of the corridor, Hangar 4. The jet, the open engine cowling, the flood of halogen light. And she heard it. The engine was running on a test cycle. She was 100 feet away, separated by glass and concrete, but she tilted her head, closed her eyes, and listened. Her lips moved. She whispered something to herself that nobody else could hear. Then she put down the pen, walked to the hangar reception desk, and said the words that would change her life. "I think I know what's wrong with that engine." The receptionist looked at her bare feet, looked at her bag, picked up the phone and called Bradley Hargrove. He arrived in 4 minutes. He took one look at Faith, her feet, her clothes, her bag, and his face twisted like he'd smelled something rotten. He didn't ask her name, didn't ask what she knew, didn't ask a single question. He turned to the 2 nearest security guards and said, "Who let this in?" That was the moment from the beginning of this story. The moment 30 people watched and said nothing. The moment Bradley called her a monkey. The moment security grabbed her arms and walked her toward the exit. But here's the detail nobody noticed. As they pulled her through the corridor, Faith turned her head one last time toward the glass wall. She pressed her palm flat against it, held it there for 3 seconds, staring at the jet. She wasn't looking at the aircraft. She was listening to it. And what she heard, what no engineer, no computer, no diagnostic tool in that entire hangar had caught, would turn out to be worth $220 million. To understand what Faith Thornton heard through that glass wall, you have to understand where she came from. Not Charlotte, not any city. Faith grew up on the edge of a scrapyard in rural Alabama, 20 miles outside Birmingham. No streetlights, no neighbors close enough to wave at, just a dirt road, a rusted trailer, and 3 acres of dead machines piled up like metal bones under the sun. That scrapyard belonged to her grandfather, Earl Thornton. Earl spent 40 years in the Birmingham steel mills, pouring iron, welding beams, breathing air that turned his lungs into sandpaper. When the mills started closing, he took his pension, what little there was, and bought a piece of land nobody wanted. He filled it with the things other people threw away. Diesel engines, tractor transmissions, old military surplus generators, church vans with blown head gaskets, farm equipment so rusted you couldn't tell what it used to be. Most people saw junk. Earl saw a classroom. Faith was 3 years old the first time Earl put a wrench in her hand. By 5, she could name every part of a small block engine by touch. By 8, she could disassemble a Cummins diesel injector pump faster than most certified mechanics. By 12, she rebuilt a scrapped Ford 300 inline 6 from memory. Earl described the assembly sequence once, and she did it without looking at a manual. Once. That's all she needed. Once. But here's the thing that made Faith different from every engineer in that Nova Crest hangar. When Earl was 59, a welding arc exploded 6 inches from his face. He lost most of the vision in his right eye. After that, he couldn't do close work anymore. Couldn't read gauges. Couldn't see hairline cracks or microfractures. So Faith became his eyes. Earl would sit on an overturned bucket, a cigarette between his fingers, and describe a problem out loud. "There's a knock in the second cylinder, probably a wrist pin, but listen first. Don't look. Listen." Faith would close her eyes, press her palm against the engine block, and feel the vibrations travel through the metal into her bones. She'd tilt her head and separate every sound: the intake, the compression, the exhaust, the way a musician separates instruments in an orchestra. Then she'd open her eyes and find it, every time. Earl taught her a method, 4 steps, always in order. Listen first, look second, touch third, decide last. Most mechanics do it backward. They see a problem, guess a cause, and start replacing parts. Earl called that throwing money at metal. He said the machine will always tell you what's wrong if you shut up long enough to hear it. Faith lived by that method the way other people live by prayer. The neighbors figured it out eventually. Word spread through the county the way it does in small towns. Slowly, then all at once. People started showing up at Earl's scrapyard with broken things. A generator that wouldn't start. A school bus transmission grinding in third gear. A church van leaking oil from somewhere nobody could find. Faith fixed them all. She was 13, 14, 15 years old, lying on her back in Alabama dirt, hands black with grease, pulling apart machines that grown men had given up on. She was never paid. Not once. Earl wouldn't allow it. The work is the receipt, he told her. People remember who kept the lights on. Faith's grandmother, Lucille, died when Faith was 12. Cancer that nobody caught in time because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away and they had no insurance. Before she died, Lucille underlined a passage in the family Bible and wrote 7 words in the margin with a ballpoint pen. Steady hands, quiet mouth, let the work talk. Faith read those words every night for the next 10 years. She read them the night before she got on that Greyhound to Charlotte. She read them the morning her boots were stolen. She read them the night after Bradley Hargrove called her a monkey in front of 30 people. Steady hands, quiet mouth. Let the work talk. That was Faith Thornton's operating system. She didn't argue. She didn't prove herself with words. She didn't beg for respect. She proved herself by doing. When the county condemned Earl's scrapyard for unpaid property taxes, Faith lost the only home she'd ever known. Earl's health was failing. His pension was gone. There was no safety net, no savings account, no relative with a spare room. Faith had no high school diploma. She dropped out at 16 to care for Earl full-time. No certifications, no references that any employer would take seriously. She heard Charlotte had jobs. She scraped together $38, packed her duffel bag, and got on a bus. She wasn't heading to Novacrest to prove anything. She wasn't chasing glory. She was trying to survive. The jet, the $50 million engine, the barefoot walk across that hangar floor, none of it was part of any plan. It was an accident of proximity, and a gift of instinct sharpened over a lifetime of listening to machines that nobody else cared about. The morning after Faith was dragged out of that hangar, Novacrest made a phone call they'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. They called Gerald Callahan. Jerry Callahan was 73 years old, retired, bad knee, walked with a cane he'd carved himself from a piece of Tennessee hickory. He wore rumpled blazers and shoes that hadn't been polished since the last president left office. But in the world of aerospace propulsion, Jerry Callahan was a living god. 31 years at Pratt & Whitney, lead engineer on 4 military turbofan programs, holder of 11 patents. The man who diagnosed the compressor stall issue on the F-119 engine that almost grounded the entire F-22 Raptor fleet in 2004. When Jerry Callahan spoke about jet engines, people didn't take notes. They recorded every word. Novacrest had been avoiding him because Jerry wasn't cheap, and because Jerry didn't care about politics, chain of command, or anyone's feelings. He arrived at Hangar 4 on a Tuesday morning, white hair uncombed, cane tapping on the polished concrete, a paper cup of gas station coffee in his free hand. Bradley Hargrove met him at the door with a handshake and a binder full of diagnostic reports. Jerry took the binder, didn't shake the hand. He spent 2 hours reading every report, every test result, every parts order, every sign-off sheet. He asked questions that made the engineers squirm, not because the questions were complicated, but because the answers exposed how little they'd actually investigated. Did anyone examine the fuel oil heat exchanger? Silence. Did anyone run the taxi test below 60 degrees ambient? Silence. Did anyone in this room actually listen to the engine with their own ears instead of staring at a screen? More silence. Jerry set the binder down on a tool cart and looked at Bradley Hargrove. You've been treating symptoms for 11 days. Nobody in this hangar has diagnosed the disease. Bradley's neck turned red, but he said nothing. Because Jerry Callahan was the one person in that building he couldn't overrule. That same morning, Faith Thornton came back to Novacrest. Not to the hangar. She wasn't crazy. She went to the janitorial office on the east side of the building to finish her cleaning job application. She sat in the plastic chair in a hallway that smelled like floor polish and old vending machine coffee. She filled out the form with the same borrowed pen from the day before. While she waited, she noticed something. The hallway shared a ventilation duct with Hangar 4. And through that duct, faint, barely there, buried under the hum of fluorescent lights, she could hear the engine running on a test cycle. Faith closed her eyes. She tilted her head the way she'd done 1,000 times in her grandfather's scrapyard, chin slightly raised, breathing slow, filtering every sound until only the engine remained. She sat like that for nearly a minute, perfectly still, eyes shut, barefoot heels pressed together on the cold tile. A janitorial supervisor walked past, looked at her, and almost told her to leave. But before he could speak, someone else stopped in the hallway. Jerry Callahan. On his way to the restroom, cane in one hand, empty coffee cup in the other, he saw Faith and froze. Not because of her bare feet, not because of her clothes. He froze because of the way she was sitting. The tilted head, the closed eyes, the absolute stillness of someone who was not sleeping, not resting, not waiting, but listening. Jerry had seen that posture exactly twice in his 50-year career. Once from a Navy acoustics specialist aboard the USS Nimitz in 1979, and once in the mirror. He stood there for 10 seconds, watching her. Then he spoke. "What do you hear?" Faith's eyes snapped open. She looked up at this old white man with a cane and a rumpled blazer, and for a moment she said nothing. She'd learned what happened when she spoke up in this building. But something in Jerry's face was different. He wasn't looking at her feet. He wasn't looking at her clothes. He was looking at her ears. "There's a hesitation in the spool-up," she said. "The high-pressure turbine is hitting a resonance it shouldn't. It sounds like a bearing cage, but it's not. It's upstream. Something in the fuel oil heat exchanger is cavitating under load." Jerry didn't move for 5 seconds. Then he said 2 words. "Come with me." When Jerry Callahan walked Faith Thornton into Hangar 4, the room went dead quiet. Every engineer, every technician, every security guard who had dragged her out the day before, all of them, staring. Bradley Hargrove saw her first. His face went from confusion to fury in under a second. "Absolutely not. She has no credentials, no clearance, no authorization. She doesn't even have shoes. She has ears, Jerry said. That's more than anyone in this hangar has shown me. This is a liability nightmare. Insurance, FAA regulations. If something happens to that engine... Jerry ignored him. He pulled out his phone and called Dolores Whitfield directly. Dolores arrived in 20 minutes. She walked into the hangar the way a general walks onto a battlefield, slow, deliberate, already angry before anyone spoke. She looked at Faith, looked at Jerry. You vouch for her? I vouch for her ears. That's more than I can say for any pair of eyes in this hangar right now. Dolores stared at Faith for a long time. Then she made a decision that would change everything. 1 hour, under Callahan's supervision. Identify the root cause, not fix it, just find it. If you can do that, we'll talk. If you can't, you walk out and you don't come back. Bradley stepped forward. Dolores, this is insane. She's a nobody off the street. She has no... Bradley. Dolores didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Your engineers have had 11 days. She gets 60 minutes. The hangar went silent. The kind of silence that has weight. Somebody handed Faith a pair of borrowed work boots. Size 10. 2 sizes too big. She laced them tight and tucked the extra space with a rag from a nearby tool cart. They gave her a visitor lanyard. White badge, red letters. Escorted access only. She clipped it to her shirt and looked at the jet. 30 people stood watching. 5 engineers who had failed. A VP who wanted her gone. A CEO who was giving her one shot. And a 73-year-old legend who had bet his reputation on a girl he'd known for less than 5 minutes. No safety net. No second chance. No room for error. If she failed, she proved every word Bradley had said about her. She'd go back to the shelter with nothing. Just another barefoot girl who didn't belong. If she succeeded, she'd do what 5 credentialed engineers couldn't do in 11 days. The clock started. 60 minutes. Faith Thornton didn't rush. She stood 10 feet from the jet for the first 2 minutes, just looking. Not at the engine, at the whole aircraft. The way it sat on the hangar floor, the angle of the cowling, the position of the ground support equipment around it. Then she turned to the nearest technician. Start the starboard engine. Idle only. The technician looked at Jerry. Jerry nodded. The engine spooled up. A low whine that climbed into a smooth, steady roar. To everyone in that hangar, it sounded normal, clean, healthy. Faith closed her eyes. She stood there. Borrowed boots too big, visitor badge crooked on her shirt, and she listened the way her grandfather had taught her. Not to the overall sound, to the layers inside it, the intake, the compressor stages, the combustion cycle, the turbine, the exhaust. Each one a voice in a choir, each one supposed to be in harmony. She raised her right hand. Advance to 60% N1, slowly. The technician pushed the throttle forward. The pitch of the engine climbed. 50%, 52, 55. At 58%, Faith's hand snapped into a fist. There! She opened her eyes. Did you hear that? Nobody answered. Rick Sattler shook his head. Dennis Cooper shrugged. Bradley crossed his arms and stared at the ceiling. Play it back in your heads, Faith said. At 58% N1, the high-pressure spool hesitates for a quarter of a second. It's not a mechanical knock. It's not a compressor stall. It's a fluid dynamic interruption. Something is disturbing the fuel flow right before the combustion chamber. But only at that specific RPM band. And only under thermal load. Jerry Callahan was leaning on his cane, near the tool cart. He hadn't said a word since the engine started, but now he straightened up. "Run it again," he said. They ran it again. This time, Jerry closed his eyes too. At 58%, his chin dipped once. A single nod. "She's right. It's there." Bradley uncrossed his arms. "That's not possible. The vibration analysis software monitors every frequency band in real time. If there was an anomaly at 58%, the system would have flagged it." Faith looked at him for the first time since she'd walked in. "Your software filters frequencies below a threshold to reduce noise in the data. That hesitation lives right under the cutoff. The computer threw it away. My ears didn't." Silence. 19 minutes gone. 41 minutes left. Faith asked the technicians to shut down the engine and let it cool. While they waited, she sat on a rolling stool next to the engine nacelle, pulled her canvas bag onto her lap, and took out a hand-drawn notebook. The pages were soft from years of use. Every page covered in pencil sketches, engine cross-sections, fuel system diagrams, valve assemblies. Not textbook drawings, self-taught drawings. The kind made by someone who learned by taking things apart and putting them back together 1,000 times. She flipped to a page near the back and ran her finger along a sketch of a fuel oil heat exchanger. "I need access to the FOHE, she said. "Starboard engine." Phil Underwood, the engineer who'd wasted 2 days on a hydraulic pump, spoke up for the first time. "The fuel oil heat exchanger? Every diagnostic code on that component is green. It passed inspection." "It passed your inspection," Faith said. "That doesn't mean it passed mine." 20 minutes later, the engine had cooled enough to work on. A technician removed the access panel to the FOHE, a metal box roughly the size of a small suitcase, bolted deep inside the engine's fuel delivery system. Faith didn't use a flashlight. She didn't use a gauge. She didn't use a scope. She used her hands. She ran her fingertips along the outer casing of the heat exchanger, starting at the outlet and moving slowly, centimeter by centimeter, toward the inlet. Her eyes were half closed. Her breathing was slow and even. Her fingers moved the way a blind person reads Braille. Light, precise, patient. Everyone watched. Nobody breathed. At the inlet side, her fingers stopped. Here, she pressed her fingertip against a spot on the casing and held it there. "There's a micro-deformation, right here. The metal is bulging outward by less than 1/3 of a millimeter. You can't see it, but you can feel it." Jerry stepped forward. He ran his own finger over the same spot. His eyebrows rose. "I'll be damned." Dennis Cooper came next. He felt it too. His face went pale. "We never even opened this panel," he said quietly. Faith explained it without raising her voice. "This deformation is a manufacturing defect. It's shipped from the factory like this. Under normal conditions, it doesn't matter. But when this heat exchanger reaches operating temperature, the metal expands. That tiny bulge becomes just large enough to create a restriction in the fuel inlet flow. That restriction causes cavitation, micro vapor bubbles forming in the fuel line. Those bubbles collapse when they hit the combustion chamber, and that's what causes your thrust disruption." Bradley's voice cut in from behind, tight, controlled, barely holding. "You're telling me a dent smaller than a fingernail took down a $50 million engine?" "I'm telling you a defect your ultrasonic testing equipment couldn't detect took down a $50 million engine because your equipment has a resolution threshold. This deformation sits below it." 38 minutes gone, 22 minutes left. Faith asked for a whiteboard, Someone rolled one over from the engineering office. It was 6 feet wide, still covered in Rick Sattler's old FADEC diagnostic notes from the week before. Faith erased it with her forearm in one long sweep. Then she picked up a black marker and started drawing. From memory. No notebook, no reference, no manual. She drew the complete fuel system schematic for the Rolls-Royce BR725 engine. Every fuel line, every valve, every junction, every sensor point, every bypass loop. The drawing covered the entire board, clean, labeled, and precise. The kind of diagram that takes an engineering team a week to draft on a computer. Faith did it in 6 minutes. The hangar was dead silent. Even Bradley had stopped talking. Then she picked up a red marker and traced the fault cascade. It starts here. She circled the FOHE inlet. Deformed casing. Under cold start conditions, the ambient temperature is low. October mornings in Charlotte, you're looking at 45 to 55 degrees. The fuel enters the heat exchanger cold. As the engine reaches operating temperature, the differential between the cold fuel and the hot casing triggers thermal expansion in the deformed area. She drew a red arrow downstream. The expansion creates a partial restriction. Fuel pressure drops just enough to cause cavitation, vapor bubbles forming in the fuel line before the combustion chamber. Another red arrow. Those bubbles reach the fuel nozzles. They disrupt the spray pattern. The combustion becomes uneven. The high-pressure turbine spool feels it as an asymmetric load. That's the hesitation I heard at 58% N1. Another red arrow. The FADEC detects the thrust anomaly and tries to compensate by adjusting the fuel trim. But it's compensating for a symptom, not a cause. So it overcompensates. That's your uncommanded thrust rollback. She capped the red marker and turned around. And here's why your 5 engineers couldn't reproduce it on the test stand. She pointed at the board. Your static test stand is inside this hangar, climate controlled, 72 degrees year-round. At that ambient temperature, the thermal differential isn't large enough to trigger the expansion. The deformation stays dormant. The engine runs clean, every time. She let that sink in. But outside, on the taxiway, in the October morning air at 50 degrees, the differential is large enough. The expansion crosses the threshold, and the engine chokes. She put the marker down. That's why it only fails during outdoor taxi tests. That's why it never shows up on your diagnostics. And that's why 5 engineers in 11 days couldn't find it. They were testing in the wrong environment, looking at the wrong component, and trusting software that was filtering out the one frequency that mattered. Jerry Callahan stood up from his chair, slowly, leaning on his cane. He walked to the whiteboard and studied the schematic for a long time. Then he turned to face the room. That is the cleanest fault analysis I've seen in 30 years. He wasn't smiling. He didn't need to. The weight of what he said landed on every person in that hangar like a hammer. 51 minutes. 9 minutes to spare. Faith Thornton, barefoot, homeless, no degree, no credentials, had just done in under an hour what 5 of Nova Crest's best engineers couldn't do in 11 days. She didn't celebrate. She didn't look at Bradley. She put the marker down, stepped back from the whiteboard, and stood with her hands at her sides. Steady hands, quiet mouth. Let the work talk. Dolores Whitfield didn't wait. She picked up her phone, called the Rolls-Royce Regional Parts Depot in Atlanta, and ordered a replacement fuel oil heat exchanger for the BR725. Priority shipment. No discussion on cost. How fast can you get it here? 4 hours. A courier van. Door to door. Dolores hung up and looked at Jerry. When the part arrives, she installs it. Bradley stepped forward. Dolores, you cannot let an uncertified civilian replace a flight-critical component on a $50 million aircraft. FAA Part 145 requires... FAA Part 145 allows supervised work under a certified technician's authority. Jerry didn't even turn around. I hold an inspection authorization. She works under my sign-off. It's legal. It's documented. It's done. Bradley opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He stood there like a man watching his own house burn from across the street. 4 hours and 11 minutes later, a white courier van pulled into the Nova Crest service bay. Inside a foam-lined crate, one factory-new fuel oil heat exchanger, serial number verified, paperwork signed. Faith carried it to the engine herself. She didn't ask for help. 2 Nova Crest technicians flanked her, not because she needed them, but because procedure required it. Jerry stood 3 feet away, leaning on his cane, watching every move. Faith removed the damaged FOHE with a precision that made the room go still. Her hands moved the way a surgeon's hands move. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no second guessing. She loosened each bolt in sequence. Not the sequence in the Rolls-Royce maintenance manual. A better sequence. One that reduced stress on the surrounding fuel lines and prevented micro-leaks at the gasket seals. Jerry noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed. The old unit came out. Faith held it up to the light and ran her thumb across the inlet deformation one last time. That tiny bulge, invisible to the eye, undetectable by ultrasonic equipment, had grounded a $50 million jet for 11 days and nearly cost Novacrest a $220 million contract. She set it on the tool cart like evidence at a crime scene. The new unit went in, torque wrench clicking in steady rhythm, fuel line connections sealed and pressure tested, electrical harness reconnected, every step documented, every step witnessed. The hangar smelled like fresh lubricant and cold metal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the background, a technician's radio played low static. Nobody talked. The only sounds were Faith's tools and her breathing. She finished in 42 minutes. "Ready for test," she said. The starboard engine spooled up. Idle. 20% N1. 40%. 50. 55. 58. No hesitation, no surge, no rollback. The thrust climbed smooth and clean through the entire operating range like a blade cutting silk. They ran it 3 more times. Perfect. Every time. Jerry called for the real test. 6:15 the next morning, October air, 51 degrees on the taxiway, the exact conditions that had caused every previous failure. Faith stood on the tarmac in her borrowed boots, arms crossed, watching the jet roll forward under its own power. Dawn was just breaking over the Charlotte skyline, a thin line of orange bleeding into gray. The engines spooled up, full taxi power, clean, smooth, flawless. No surge, no rollback, no hesitation at 58%. Nothing. The jet was alive again. The tarmac erupted. Technicians clapped. Ground crew whistled. Dennis Cooper walked straight to Faith and shook her hand with both of his. Rick Sattler stood back, arms folded, but he nodded. Once. Slow. The nod of a man who knows he just watched something he'll never forget. Jerry Callahan placed his hand on Faith's shoulder, gently, the way a grandfather would. He leaned close enough that only she could hear. "Your grandfather taught you well." Faith looked at him. Her eyes were wet. But she didn't cry. She'd been holding herself together for too long to let go now. She looked down at her borrowed boots, size 10, stuffed with rags, laces double knotted, and said the only thing that was true. "I just didn't want to go back to the shelter tonight." Jerry's hand tightened on her shoulder. He didn't let go for a long time. Then Dolores Whitfield walked across the tarmac. She didn't smile. Dolores never smiled, but she extended her hand, palm open, steady, waiting. "What's your name?" In 11 days, through 5 engineers, 2 security removals, and 1 public humiliation, not a single person at Novacrest had asked Faith Thornton her name. Until now. "Faith Thornton, ma'am." Dolores held her hand and looked her in the eyes. "Faith, that jet flies to Nevada in 8 days. You're going to make sure it stays airworthy. We'll discuss terms in my office." Disgusting. They called her a monkey, a stray, an animal. And she was the one who saved their $50 million jet. Imagine that was you. Would you still have walked back into that hangar? 2 hours after that taxi test, Faith Thornton sat in Dolores Whitfield's corner office on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a view of the runway where the jet had just come back to life. Faith was still wearing the borrowed boots, still wearing the visitor badge, still carrying the canvas duffel bag she'd walked in with 2 days ago. Dolores sat across from her and slid a folder across the desk. This isn't a janitorial contract. It was an offer letter. Special Technical Consultant, Novacrest Aerospace, reporting directly to Gerald Callahan for a 6-month mentorship assignment on the Pentagon Defense Contract Project. Salary, benefits, full medical, company housing, a furnished 1-bedroom apartment 4 miles from the campus. And one more line at the bottom. Full sponsorship for a GED completion program and FAA airframe and power plant certification through an accredited program in Charlotte. Faith read it twice. Her hands didn't shake, but her jaw tightened the way it does when someone is trying very hard not to fall apart. "I have one condition," she said. Dolores raised an eyebrow. "My grandfather, Earl Thornton, he's in Birmingham. His health is failing, and he can't afford proper care. I need to bring him here." Dolores didn't hesitate. "Done. We'll arrange transport and connect him with our corporate medical provider this week." Faith signed the offer letter with the same borrowed pen she'd used on the janitorial application 2 days earlier. That afternoon, Jerry Callahan did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He sat down and wrote a formal engineering report. Not for Novacrest, but for SAE International, the global authority on aerospace and automotive engineering standards. The report detailed the diagnostic methodology Faith had used: acoustic detection, tactile inspection, and thermal differential fault analysis. He listed Faith Thornton as co-author, first name on the paper. The report circulated through the aerospace maintenance community within weeks. Faith didn't become famous. She didn't go viral. She didn't end up on talk shows. But in the rooms that mattered, the hangars, the repair stations, the engineering labs, people started saying her name. The barefoot girl who heard what the computers couldn't. 8 days later, Dolores Whitfield's Gulfstream G650ER flew to Nevada right on schedule. The Pentagon evaluators never knew how close they came to never boarding that jet. Novacrest secured the $220 million defense contract. While Faith Thornton was rebuilding her life, the system was catching up with Bradley Hargrove. It started quietly, the way these things always do. 3 days after the jet flew to Nevada, Dolores Whitfield called an internal review of the engineering division's diagnostic protocols. On the surface, it was routine, a post-incident audit. Standard procedure after a grounded aircraft, nothing personal. But Dolores wasn't looking at procedures. She was looking at patterns. The review team pulled 3 years of records. Every diagnostic sign-off, every external consultant engagement, every hiring recommendation, and every rejection that passed through Bradley Hargrove's desk. What they found made Dolores close her office door and call outside legal counsel. In the past 36 months, Bradley had blocked, reassigned, or terminated 4 external consultants and contract technicians. All 4 were people of color. 2 were black, 1 was Hispanic, 1 was Native American. Each time, Bradley used the same language in his paperwork. Credential concerns, not a cultural fit, insufficient institutional alignment, clean words, professional words, the kind of words that don't trigger alarms in an HR system designed to look the other way. But lined up in a row, 4 names, 4 dismissals, 4 identical justifications, the pattern was impossible to ignore. 2 of those 4 consultants had filed formal complaints with NovaCrest's HR department. 1 in January of the previous year, 1 8 months before that. Both complaints were reviewed. Both were closed. Insufficient evidence to proceed. The HR manager who closed both cases reported directly to Bradley Hargrove. When Dolores read that line in the report, she didn't slam her fist on the desk. She didn't shout. She picked up the phone, called NovaCrest's outside counsel, and said 4 words. I want him out. But Dolores was a systems thinker. She didn't just want Bradley gone, she wanted to make sure the next Bradley couldn't happen. The following Monday, Bradley Hargrove was placed on administrative leave. His engineering approvals were revoked. His building access was suspended. His files were transferred to outside counsel for a full civil rights compliance review. There was no press conference, no public shaming, no viral moment. Just a man in a $4,000 suit standing in a parking garage holding a cardboard box of personal belongings, watching his key card bounce off the security scanner with a red light and a short beep. The same sound Faith heard when security dragged her toward the exit. The same short beep. Bradley Hargrove wasn't destroyed. He wasn't arrested. He wasn't humiliated in front of 30 people the way he'd humiliated Faith. He was simply and professionally held accountable. For a man who had spent 19 years building his identity on institutional power, that was worse than any public spectacle. The system he had weaponized against others had finally turned around and looked him in the eye. 2 weeks later, Dolores signed a company-wide policy change. Effective immediately, all walk-in applicants and external technical consultants would undergo an anonymous skills assessment. No names, no photos, no background information. Just a test of what you could do. Credentials would be reviewed separately, after capability was demonstrated, not before. The internal memo named the policy the Thornton Protocol. Faith didn't ask for it. She didn't know about it until Jerry told her over coffee in the campus break room. She looked at the memo for a long time, then folded it and put it in her canvas bag next to her grandmother's Bible. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The work had already talked. 6 months later, Faith Thornton sat at a workstation in Hangar 4. Steel-toed boots she bought with her own paycheck. A NovaCrest badge with her name on it, not a visitor pass. On her desk, the worn Bible, open to Lucille's handwriting. Next to it, an FAA certification study guide, half finished, covered in pencil notes. Her grandfather, Earl, was in a rehab facility 12 minutes from her apartment, getting stronger every week. He'd called her that morning and said, "You kept the lights on, baby girl." Every Saturday, Faith drove to the same shelter where someone stole her boots. She taught engine repair to young women who reminded her of herself. No credentials required, just steady hands and a willingness to listen. She wasn't famous, she wasn't rich, she was building. Sometimes the most qualified person in the room is the one nobody invited. Unbelievable.